Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to make a contribution on the National Disability Insurance Scheme Amendment Improving Supports for At-Risk Participants Bill. As many of the contributors have noted, this bill proposes changes that will implement recommendations 1, 6, 7, 8 and 9 of the Robertson Review into the tragic death of Adelaide NDIS recipient Anne-Marie Smith. And I want to begin by saying how dreadfully sorry I am on behalf of the 150,000 constituents of Shortland that Anne-Marie Smith went through what she did before she tragically and untimely died. The system failed her, and this bill is important because it's an attempt to repair the system, at least partially, to make sure that that does not happen again. Labor is supporting the bill in the House and will move amendments in the Senate to clarify the basis upon which participant information can be shared and to require the Minister to have a review of the bill to ensure stakeholders' future consultation on these important issues. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a proud Labor legacy, one of the key achievements of the Gillard government, and history will record that Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister that introduced this scheme to make clear to our fellow Australians with disability that whatever support they need to live fulfilling and dignified lives, they will get. Imagine the lives of people with disability and their families and support networks at this current time of the pandemic if there was no disability insurance scheme. 10 years ago, there was no such scheme. And in fact, I remember attending the launch of the Hunter pilot scheme with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in the middle of 2013, and it was a historic day for the Hunter as one of the pilot regions for the NDIS. In talking on this bill, which the government maintains is about improving support for at-risk participants, I briefly want to go back to the creation of the scheme. The Productivity Commission reported the following to the Rudd government. The current disability support system is underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient. It gives people with a disability little choice, no certainty of access to appropriate supports and little scope to participate in the community. This assessment was 10 years ago. Disappointing that for all the progress that has been made, my constituents with disabilities still have issues with choice, having decisions made for them rather than making their own decisions. And also issues with certainty when there are annual plan reviews, not to mention the insidious independent assessments introduced by the Liberals and Nationals. And in speaking on the Improving Supports for At-Risk Participants Bill, I want to draw to the attention of the House one of the biggest issues NDIS participants have dealt with over the past year, and that's the attempted introduction of independent assessments, which is a shameful indictment on the Morrison-Joyce government and clearly undermines the claims by this government of a bipartisan commitment to the NDIS. Because the truth is, through attempting to introduce independent assessments, they were trying to make life more difficult for people with disability. And that's not an accusation I make lightly. But the fact is that independent assessments would have been a blunt instrument deployed by this cruel Conservative government to cut funding to NDIS participants. An example of the cruelty of these so-called independent assessments with my own constituents I've raised in the House before, and that's the case of a 6-year-old. His grandmother contacted my office because his mother was too distressed too. This young boy's plan had been cut from $100,000 a year to just $8,000 a year. That's over a 90% cut in funding to his plan. And what did this mean for him in terms of practicalities? His core support had been reduced from 35 hours a week to just 5, a gigantic cut. This boy has a rare genetic disorder. His mother is a single mother. The reason given by the independent assessor for this drastic reduction is that now that he was at school, he didn't need this support. This overlooks the fact that he was at school last year and needed 35 years of support, and now all of a sudden he doesn't. The question I ask the government, and I indeed generally, is who is best placed to assess a participant's needs? It's their doctors, their allied health professionals, their carers, the people who know their disability their most? Or is it some random from a private contractor the government was going to pay $339 million to with the explicit intent of making cost savings? The answer to this, obviously, is those that know the participant best are best placed to determine their needs, not some so-called independent assessor with a clear incentive to cut costs in the scheme. And in fact, the only reason independent assessments were shelved for the moment is that it was met with universal condemnation of them by NDIS participants, NDIS stakeholders, state and territory governments. And I thank and acknowledge all those who fought for these against these changes and succeeded in another U-turn from the Liberals and Nationals. The take-home lesson from this sordid independent assessment experiment is that the Liberals and Nationals will not hesitate to attack the foundations of the NDIS just to save money, and this is plainly wrong. Another example of that is I regularly get families of kids with autism in tears because they've gone through a review of their plan and they've found that their plan has been massively cut. And the reason that the National Disability Insurance Agency has given for the cut in the plan is that clearly the plan is not working because the child with autism is not getting better. They are not recovering from the autism. Whereas the families and every independent expert has made the case to me, you don't recover from autism, you learn to live with it and to fulfil your potential. That is just another example of this government's callous attacks on the NDIS and the participants of it. I've also had cases of where someone's NDIS plan was dramatically slashed when they finished high school and went on to university. And the justification given by the agency was because they were going to be under a lot less stress being at university than at high school. Well, I just don't see how they could have made that assessment. University is as stressful, if not more stressful for many people than high school. So to cut someone's plan so callously because of such an arbitrary decision just, I think, further emphasises the real motivations of this government. I'd also like to talk about the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission component of the bill. I want to draw to the attention of the House a situation one of my constituents is experiencing right now. This constituent is highly vulnerable. I won't go into a particular condition, but like most of the country, my Shortland electorate is in lockdown. And an issue has arisen for my constituent regarding her support worker having access to help her during the lockdown. My parliamentary liaison has had to refer this issue that the constituent is having with her provider to the Commission. And the above complex situation demonstrates the urgent need for an effective crop on the beat. Labor believes that everything possible should be done to protect people with a disability from neglect and abuse. The Commission has a fundamentally important role to play, and yet is ineffective and understaffed. Unfortunately, this bill does nothing to address the significant holes in the NDIS safeguarding that is evident from this Commission. And the truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a pilot region for the NDIS, my electorate and the participants within my electorate have gone through many generations of plans. And in fact, at one stage, I had the distinction of having more complaints and issues before the NDIA than any other electorate in the country. More must be done to improve the system. More must be done to improve it for constituents in my electorate. It's all very well and proper for the government to brag about it being a demand-driven program, but every year billions of dollars is cut from the NDIS because this government has put in place systems and staffing cuts to choke demand. We can say it's demand-driven, but if you choke demand, if you restrict demand, if you cut plans in a thoroughly unscientific way, you are cutting the NDIS, and you're doing a great disservice to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Australians, because ultimately the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a fundamental compact between the Australian society and Australians with a disability. A compact that says that we will not leave you behind. We will make sure that no matter how your disability occurred, whether it was through birth, a freak accident, some other mechanism, we will allow you and support you to fulfil your true potential. Not just to give you the most fulfilling life possible, but so that your potential and your contribution to society is not lost. And this government is destroying that fundamental principle with its cuts and attacks on the NDIS. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll finish by noting that tonight is the opening ceremony of the Paralympic Games in Tokyo, and we wish all our Australian Paralympians well. And I'd like to give a special shout out to my constituent, Reed McCracken, and wish all of them the best of luck. One of Australia's most distinguished Paralympians is Hunter local Kurt Fernley. He's also one of the most eloquent and effective advocates for the NDIS. And he said the following on properly funding the NDIS, and I quote, "People with disabilities' lives do not live and die around an election. We're here for good, and if you want to make permanent gains, you've got to give permanent funding. The government should heed the advice of Kurt regarding funding. They should also support the amendments of my colleagues will make in the other place to strengthen this bill." The National Disability Insurance Scheme, as I said, is a contract that Australia, as a prosperous first world social democracy, has with people with disability. And unfortunately for my constituents, its potential is not being realised.